Hi, my name is Felix Gervits. I'm a brand new postdoc with the Army Research Lab, and formerly I was a grad student at Tufts University in the Human Robot Interaction Lab. So I'm going to be talking today about some work I did at the end of my grad career. So the title here is It's About Time, Turn Entry Timing for Situated Human-Robot Dialogue. So as a main motivation here, we know that humans are really good at exchanging turns in conversation. We can do this really quickly on the order of a few hundred milliseconds. And it's thought that we mainly do this by using a variety of cues to predict a turn, an ongoing turn, and then plan our turn while the person is talking. So it's thought that we use lexicosyntactic cues primarily, among other cues as well. So that's what we're going to focus on in this talk. And current dialogue systems, they really don't have this capability apart from a few research prototypes. But this kind of fluid turn taking can benefit systems in a variety of ways, including improved response latency, which could lead to more natural interactions. It could support a wide range of overlap behaviors, including supportive ones, such as back channel feedback or collaborative completions. And for situated agents that interact in an environment, aka robots, it can allow actions to be initiated early, or what we call preemptive action execution, which could save time. So to support this kind of fluid turn taking, we're developing a computational framework. So the first part of the framework here is a model that can make incremental predictions about an ongoing utterance. So if it gets the input, go to, it might predict either go to the kitchen, go to the bedroom, etc. And to inform this, we use contextual information to bias the predictions. And this could include stuff about the perceptual context, the task knowledge, the dialogue history, etc. And we also have a turn entry manager component, which gets information from the utterance prediction component, estimates the duration of the prediction, and then uses that to compute these different entry points and to determine when a system could take a turn. So this is all integrated into our robotic architecture, specifically the diarch architecture, and we evaluate this on a corpus of human-robot dialogue. So the utterance prediction component, we use a bigram language model to generate these predictions. There are other ways you could do this, but this is a simple, quick way, and that represents some of the kind of information that we care about. So here's a quick example of how this works for an input word, go, and let's say we're in the context kitchen. So it basically generates this tree for every input word that comes into the system and generates these full utterance predictions. So here you can see that go to the kitchen was the top prediction that was made here. And that was largely because the bigram the kitchen was heavily biased because we're in the context kitchen. So there's more detail in the paper, but that's kind of a general overview of how the prediction model works. Before I discuss the turn entry management algorithm, I want to make a brief note about the different entry points that the system could come in. So a lot of this is based on the work by Gail Jefferson in conversation analysis. She studied speech overlap. So we're going to ignore these first two types of overlap because they're more accidental. These have to do with simultaneous startup. But the first kind of overlap we're going to discuss is interjacent overlap. So this occurs kind of when somebody comes in about midway through the utterance, not near a transition point. Usually this is done to clarify, repair a problematic utterance, or to just express, uncertainty about what was said. There's also a last item overlap, which is any overlap that occurs at the last word or last lexical item of a turn. And this is not intrusive. Usually it's done to kind of transition the turns very smoothly without any kind of gap. And then finally, TRP entry, which is not overlap at all. This is entry at the transition relevance place, or the transition point between turns. This is kind of the ideal point that we mostly want the system to come in. So now onto the turn entry management. This is a component we have that's situated in the dialogue manager of the architecture. It's largely an algorithm that we developed. The way that it works is, again, there's more detail in the paper. I'm just going to kind of gloss over this. But basically, for every word that comes in, we generate a full utterance prediction of that word. And then we compute these different entry points that I just showed in the previous slide. So for the TRP entry, we get the start time of the utterance. We add an estimated duration, which we compute using the syllable count of the full utterance, and then we multiply each syllable by 180 milliseconds. This is the average syllable duration in the switchboard corpus. It's a very kind of crude way of getting the utterance duration, but it seems to be pretty effective. And then we take into account the text-to-speech delay as well. So in this way, we compute the different entry points. We also simulate the actions because, again, this is for situated agents. A lot of times the The utterances are commands or instructions to perform some kind of action. So we need to know if the action will succeed or not. So we do this by checking the preconditions of the action. And if the preconditions fail, we generate a failure explanation right away. This will usually be an interjacent overlap, something like, sorry, I can't do that. And in the case that the action will succeed, we set the response type. We have a policy here to determine when the system should come in and when it should take the action. So our simple policy is that it'll just come in at the TRP basically every time, although we can change this to produce overlap if we need. And we also have it perform the action as early as possible, although again, we can delay that if necessary. And finally, we have a separate process here to determine when the response should actually come. So in the case of a TRP entry, we want to basically wait until that TRP entry point has been reached. And then as soon as it's reached, we initiate the response. And since we took into account the text-to-speech delay already, ideally, the system should come in right at the TRP. So in terms of the architectural integration, this is a configuration of the DIARC, Cognitive Robotic Architecture. It looks very familiar, I'm sure, to anybody who's worked with dialogue systems. And as an example of an utterance in our framework, like running through the architecture here, let's say we have the word go come in at t=0. This comes into the speech recognizer with just a single word. The utterance prediction component, let's say, generates the full prediction, go to the kitchen. Although in many cases, it'll take multiple words before a prediction is generated that is above threshold. But it gets go to the kitchen as text. That is sent to the semantic parser, or the NLU component, which converts that into a logical predicate. And then that is sent to the dialogue manager, which contains the turn entry management algorithm. And that computes all these different values, including the duration, the different entry points, and then the action and the response associated with that command. So in order to evaluate this, we tested we ran 96 utterances from the HURIC corpus, which is the human-robot interaction corpus. And it's basically a very small corpus of simple commands to a household robot. So things like go to the kitchen, grab the bottle on the table, these kind of commands. And we use text input as opposed to speech. The reason we did this was to avoid some of the noise associated with speech input, kind of abstract away some of that. So we kind of simulated incremental speech input using text. So we used, basically we set a timing for each of the syllables coming in to be 180 milliseconds, just like in the algorithm. And I'll discuss at the end a little bit about some of the limitations of doing it that way. In terms of our primary measure, we used the floor transfer offset, or FTO. And this is basically just the difference in time between the start of the second turn and the end of the first turn. So an FTO of 0 here means that there was a fluid transition. A positive FTO means that there was a gap, and a negative FTO means that there was overlap. And our main hypothesis was that the framework would support accurate TRP entry, so FTO would be close to 0. It would also support early actions and interjacent overlap, especially compared to a non-incremental baseline system. So in terms of the results, we found fairly accurate, the prediction model was fairly accurate at about 71%, and the predictions themselves were made about halfway into an utterance on average. So we did find that the framework led to smaller FTOs compared to the non-incremental system. And the non-incremental system was just the DIARC architecture without any of the components we added and without incrementality. So you can see on the histogram here, part B, this is the distribution of FTOs for the 68 utterances that the system correctly predicted. And you can see that it was about 1.4 milliseconds, well, sorry, 1.4 seconds, or 1400 milliseconds was about the average entry time. So this is pretty consistent with other non-incremental systems. And up here in A, you can see our system came in basically right around 0. So the mean FTO was negative 1.1. So, and not surprisingly, the difference here is statistically significant. We also found that the framework supports interjacent overlap, specifically for the 15 predictions that were unactionable. There was no action corresponding to them. The system came in about 680 milliseconds before the transition point, before the end of the utterance. And in some cases, you can see it even came in to over 2 seconds early, depending on how early it made the prediction. We also found preemptive action execution, where the earliest action started about 635 milliseconds into an utterance, like on average across all of the the trials. So this represents very early actions. So here's a demo video I'm going to show you where we got this running on a PR2 robot using speech input. And here is a comparison between the non-incremental system and the incremental one. So here's our baseline system.
Can you please drop the apple on the kitchen table?
So you can see there was a bit of a delay there. Here's our prediction model.
Can you please drop the apple on the kitchen table?
So this is when it tried to come in at the TRP, and you can see that it was a lot more fluid than the previous one. Here's the baseline system when it can't do an action because the preconditions aren't met.
Can you please drop the apple on the kitchen table?
I cannot release apple because I am not dressed in anything.
And here's the same example with our prediction system coming in early.
Can you please drop the apple on the kitchen
I
table?
cannot do that because I am not dressed in anything.
Okay, so that shows the interjason overlap. And finally, here's the last item overlap with our system.
Can you please drop the apple on the kitchen table?
Okay, so very quickly, the main limitation here, I think, is in the evaluation, where we used text input and we had a fixed word duration estimate. So obviously that's not going to be the case with real speech. So to kind of demonstrate this, we did a small supplementary evaluation, still using text input, but we used a variable duration for each syllable. So now instead of being fixed at 180 milliseconds, it was now a random number between 100 and 200 milliseconds. And the algorithm also computed a random number as well for its estimate. And we actually found good performance here. We still found an FTO very close to 0. In this case, it was negative 16.5 with an acceptable range of performance. So thank you for listening to my talk. Here's my contact information if you have any questions.